Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the keynote speakers program, the current challenges to the European integration. I am thrilled for having such an amazing panel for this afternoon's session. Let me briefly introduce you to the three speakers. We have Brigitt Laffan, Emeritus Professor, Robert Schuman Center for Advanced Studies, European University Institute. We've got Paivi Leino-Sandberg, Professor of Transnational European Law, Deputy Director, Eric Castren Institute of International Law and Human Rights, Director of Master's Program of Global Governance Law, Faculty of Law, University of Helsinki. And we've got Professor Paul de Grauwe, John Paulson Chair in European Political Economy, European Institute, London School of Economics and Political Science. It's an amazing panel that will guide us through the intricacies of the challenges to the integration of the European economy. Let me give the floor first to Brigitt. She will be talking about European Union, geopolitics, collective power Europe and its limits. Then we'll give the floor to Paivi. She will talk about fiscal integration post new generation European EU. And last but not the least, Paul will revisit the fragility of the Eurozone. Brigitt, the floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for the invitation to be part of this panel. I look forward very much to our discussion. Let me share my screen, and I hope all will work. And begin from the beginning. It's not... I'm looking so that I can make it a PowerPoint, and it doesn't seem to be.
Yeah, down towards the right-hand side of your panel.
Yeah, it's just not. It's not giving me the icon. Ah, here we are.
The other on the right.
Yeah, yeah. Here we are.
Should be there.
Okay.
Yeah, right.
So. Thank you very much and good afternoon, everyone. When asked to speak about the challenges facing the EU, there is such a broad tapestry available of challenges that I was wondering how best to contribute. So then I thought perhaps let's start where we are. In other words, because of the momentous shift, the momentous moment that a moment of truth for Europe that the 24th of February was. In other words, the war in Ukraine. But in a way, it's very important to situate the war in Ukraine in the much wider context of the international system that Europe faces, and also the challenges Europe has faced globally for quite some time now. And in a way, one has to almost go back to Obama, his sense that there needed in US foreign policy not to desert Europe in any way, but rather to rebalance. In other words, that the US as a global superpower needed to be attentive also to what was happening in Asia and to strengthen its presence in and links to. And that's widely known as the pivot to Asia. And in Europe at the time, and almost since then, there was always a sense and a concern that perhaps Europe, in terms of US foreign policy, was declining as a priority, that it was not the priority it once was. And of course, there always is in Europe then that anxiety about the American commitment to the defense and security of Europe. So the pivot certainly, at least among elites in Europe, began a conversation. And then we had the shocks of 2016 and two shocks. Firstly, a large member state voted to leave the EU, the United Kingdom. It was a permanent member of the UN Security Council. It had nuclear weapons, and in terms of defense was one of what the French might call the pays sérieux in Europe. So the impact of Brexit on its relations with the continental Europe and also Ireland was clearly shifting. And then shortly after that, that was the June shock, but then we had the Trump shock. And we had the arrival in the White House of someone who wasn't just skeptical about the EU. He really didn't like it. It verged on Europhobia. And over the next couple of years, and there was a sense that Trump might take the US even out of NATO, or at least that the Article 5 commitments were not quite what they once were. And that led Chancellor Merkel, after I think it was a G7 in 2017, to say the times when we could fully rely on others have passed us by. In other words, that sense of that cast iron guarantee from the US. But of course, all this has to be seen more generally in shifts in the global order, the emergence of great power competition between the US and China, the classical rising, declining power, and what kind of world order that would lead to, but more importantly, where Europe could find itself in this competitive environment. Because Europe had a tremendous commitment. It's a reflex for multilateralism. That's the DNA of the system, that the EU is a multilateral institution, favors multilateralism, and promotes multilateralism. But in a world of great power competition, but also we saw the global institutions under considerable strain, not least the WTO, but all the systems of global governance became much more contested and much more, many more constraints. Then this was not the world that Europe was comfortable in. And in a way, it was a sense that the world was becoming less like Europe rather than more like Europe. And add to this then the volatility in the neighborhood, both to the south, with the Arab Spring turning extraordinarily sour very quickly, but also to the east, the annexation of Crimea and the Russian incursions in the Donbass. So, coming up to the 24th of February, Europe faced the strains the strains facing Europe, given what was happening more globally, both global governance, great power competition, etc., etc. And that led to what can only be described as a very incoherent discussion within Europe about the framing was European sovereignty. This was very much a Macron framing. In other words, that Europe needed more power, sovereignty, particularly to deal with that world out there. And then there was a related discussion about strategic autonomy. Now, the word open was frequently added to this, open strategic autonomy, because Europe wanted to signal that it wanted to be part of the global system, was open to that, and that this was not a protectionist turn in Europe, but that strategic autonomy was to act in concert with others wherever possible, but to act unilaterally, to have autonomous capacity to act if necessary. So this debate percoled on in terms of what its institutional implications, its budgetary implications, its power implications in terms of competences for the EU, etc., etc. And all that was bubbling up in the system over the last, certainly over the last 5 to 6 years, half a decade. there also was a sense that Europe didn't have all the time in the world to adjust to this new world. In other words, that there were choices that had to be made in Europe. And Joseph Borrell, in his first letter to the foreign affairs ministers in December 19, as he was about to chair his first foreign affairs council, he said, Europe has the option of becoming a player, a true geostrategic actor, or being mostly the playground. In other words, player or playground. Which was it to be for Europe? And that was the sort of stark challenging the heads of government, challenging the foreign ministries in the member states, challenging the capitals. Do you want to be a plaything, or will Europe develop as a geostrategic actor? And so, his use of the phrase geostrategic meant that he wasn't just thinking of the traditional strong powers that the EU has, trade, but he wanted Europe to go beyond that. And then on February the 24th this year, certainly Europe, but also more generally, the world tilted. That there was it was the return of war to Europe. Now, we've had war and conflict in Europe. The Balkans was the collapse of the former Yugoslavia was extremely bloody and extremely dangerous. But this was a direct challenge to that Helsinki system that said you do not change borders through the use of force. It was also an extraordinary shattering of illusions in some capitals in Europe. In my view, there should have been no illusions, but certainly for a very long time, both Berlin but also Paris felt that you could do business with Putin and that you should do business with Putin. In other words, that diplomacy would work. And we had, vis-a-vis Ukraine, we had the whole Minsk process, which really was attentive to the interests of Russia, but that in and of itself didn't prevent in any way Putin's war of aggression. So on the 24th of February, illusions were shattered and Europe found itself, woke up to a very different world. And that was a world that the Baltic states and the Central East European states, particularly Poland, had been warning about for a very long time. So diplomacy no longer possible. War has returned to Europe, an illegal war under the UN Charter, and of course, a war that is proving to be extremely bloody, and the evidence of war crimes are clearly already there. But this wasn't just an attack. Putin's war in Ukraine is not an attack just on Ukraine. It's an attack on the post-Cold War settlement. It was an attempt to reorder Europe's security architecture, to undermine NATO, and to legitimize a Russian sphere of influence in its neighborhood. In other words, these countries had no right to independent agency and independent choice. Rather, they would become or were vassal states for Russia. And the whole way Putin talks about Ukraine, he basically doesn't recognize any Ukrainian agency. He doesn't recognize at its core the right of Ukraine to exist. And therefore, all of the issues that I spoke about, all of the challenges that were there over the last decade on the EU agenda simply become much, much more urgent and much more challenging for Europe, because we're now, I suspect, in for a long haul. So how did Europe/EU respond to the events of the 24th of February? The first thing I would say is that the response was very rapid, robust, and unprecedented, and much more rapid, robust, and unprecedented than I would have imagined even on the 23rd of February. And I think there was a shift because of that shattering of illusions. There was a shift that this war was something that Europe had no choice about, but had to, there was no alternative. It had to respond. One of the main instruments of response this is a classical instrument in war, sanctions. And the EU has now, we're up to the 6th sanctions package. The Commission had prepped sanctions beforehand, so there was a lot of very careful work done in the lead up to the invasion. And that meant that, in a sense, Europe could, within days, had a sanctions package on the table and agreed, and then this was ratcheted up one after the other. Apropos sanctions, the 6th package was much more difficult for the EU than the previous ones, and it required a European Council to unblock, which meant it really did require Europe's political leaders to sit around a table and get there, and only got agreement with concessions to the Orban government in Budapest. But sanctions, a very important part. The game changer was the European Peace Facility. This was a pot of money that the EU had. It was originally the Africa Fund, had been renamed as ironically, as the European Peace Facility. But within 72 hours of the invasion, money had been released to purchase lethal weapons for Ukraine. So the so-called peace facility had become a war facility, and the EU was using public finance to buy weapons to support a third country. Unprecedented. In terms of the refugee and the movement of people, of course, there was a very high level of dislocation of people within Ukraine, and millions left. And for the first time since it became law in 2004, the EU used the Temporary Protective Directive, which essentially gives Ukrainians much stronger rights as refugees in Europe than those who are not protected by this directive. In other words, refugees from all over the world. In other words, a distinction was being drawn between refugees flowing to Europe from a European country and from non-European countries. And then finally, there was budgetary support, macroeconomic support, because of course the Ukraine economy is in bits and its public finances are shattered. So the European response, and it was done, European Council, the Foreign Affairs Council, and the Commission worked hand in glove in order to deliver the level of response and the continuing level of response. But very quickly, the EU leadership understood that it was one thing to have a European policy on the war in Ukraine, and quite another to begin to take cognizance of what this war would mean to the EU itself. In other words, bringing it home. This war was not something happening out there. It was not just Ukraine. And so in Versailles, it was an informal European Council hosted by the French presidency on the 10th and 11th of March. So very quickly, there was a whole section on what Europe needed to do, the decisive steps it needed to take to build European sovereignty. And note the inclusion of the phrase European sovereignty. That would not have happened in the communiqué unless it was a French presidency, because I'm going to argue that, in fact, what the war suggests is that sovereignty is not the issue when it comes to defense and security, because Europe is not, and certainly there's no indication can be sovereign in defense. But it did identify those areas that Europe needed to work on. Firstly, defense and security. Secondly, reducing the extraordinary energy dependency on Russia. Thirdly, looking at a more robust economic base. In other words, supply chains, what would happen globalization, what is happening globalization as a consequence, not just of this war, but other developments. Are we looking at a more regionalized world? How much decoupling is going on and how much decoupling will go on? So there was an outline of a very transformative agenda from the heads of government. And then there was the unexpected, in my view, link to enlargement, because the EU suffered from enlargement fatigue after the last Big Bang enlargement. And as we know, Croatia 2013 is the last country to join. No one, I think, in the capitals wanted enlargement, but the applications from Ukraine and neighbors meant that enlargement was back on the table with a bang, and that generates extraordinary challenges for the EU, because we now look towards an EU of probably well into the 33, 4, we don't know where it ends. So I think that what this means is that the war in Ukraine has had extraordinary consequences for the EU, not just in the immediate period, but also longer term, that it will shift the dial on integration in a very real way. But of course, there's still a war being prosecuted in Europe, and there doesn't seem to be any end in sight. We don't know, neither Washington nor Brussels nor any of the national capitals have any sense in A, where this might end up, but B, what are the goals for, and there seems to be agreement that Ukraine can't lose. But what does that actually mean? Does it mean that Ukraine will be supported up to the border of Russia? And of course, Russia is a nuclear power, real concern about escalation and about the deployment of tactical nuclear weapons, if not chemical and biological. So for NATO, they want to support Ukraine, but do not want a direct conflict with Russia. And I think that's the sane and sensible thing. But how much support the West will continue to give Ukraine, there's no sign at the moment. The US in particular is very supportive. But what is the end game? There's no evident ceasefire available at the moment. And of course, Ukraine itself, having fought this war, having all that bloodshed, must be the one to decide what its ultimate agreement would be with Russia. Of course, Russia can end this war within an hour by simply calling a ceasefire and withdrawing. But again, there's no hint of that. And then there is what we're beginning to experience in Europe are the consequences of the war for energy prices, inflation, food security. And what will that do if there's a cost of living crisis in the EU? What does that do to domestic politics? What sorts of tensions will arise because of that? Will support for Ukraine erode over time? The European publics have been extraordinarily supportive, both of the refugees, but also of Ukraine. But will that continue, particularly if we see an inflationary spiral, et cetera, et cetera? So I think the fact that we're probably looking at a longer rather than shorter war then that raises all sorts of longer term issues about the staying power of the West on this.
Brigitt, can you conclude in 5 minutes?
Yes. Yeah.
Very good.
So in terms of what kind of power the EU can become, firstly, normative power Europe, which was the classical, the EU is a civilian power, a soft power. That's not a power that's equipped for the hard geopolitics of the 21st century. So Europe must become a stronger collective power. And that means using the whole and the parts, coalitions of the willing, subsets of member states. And that can only happen. I would argue that there has been a strengthening of collective power in Europe over the last since 2016, but it's very contingent on the availability of leadership and framing and a high level of consensus, on the capacity of the governance system of the EU to work together, and on agility about the toolkit and what the EU can use. And it has shown those, in my view, across Brexit, the pandemic, and Ukraine to now. But Europe remains, there are real deficits and real vulnerabilities. The first is European security is transatlantic, and the big danger for Europe is not that it won't have the strategic capacity itself, but rather that the US post the next election we could end up with a Trump 2 or a smarter Trump. And so, in other words, that big question for the EU remains. But the EU has a role to play. If European states are going to spend more money on defense, the European states can't afford to waste this money, and interoperability, et cetera, is very poor in Europe. So there really needs to be a focus on strategic capability, energy, and then climate, and of course enlargement. So there are, although the EU responded, in my view, effectively to Ukraine to date, those deficits and vulnerabilities are very are there, they're deep, and they're challenging. And I leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Brigitt, for setting the stage for such a complex challenges facing the European communities. And let me give the floor to Paivi Leino-Sandberg. I'm sure you're going to pick on some of the issues related to the governance of the European Union, I'm sure, because they connect very nicely with the ground set by Brigitt. The floor is yours, Paivi. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the invitation to join this great panel. And I think I will actually come to some of the issues that were just mentioned towards the end as well. But I thought I'm going to talk about, let me see how this one moves. I actually want to talk about two things in particular: money and democracy, and how they come together, and what happens to them when a crisis hits Europe, as it has done so many times during the past years. And basically, I have one argument, which is rather simple. It's just that the crisis of the past 10 years or so, they really have led to a particular pattern, which basically means that when there is a crisis, then there is a chance to realize many institutional ambitions that have been impossible until then, often for legal reasons in particular. I'm a lawyer, I should point that out. And that this crisis context, in a way, it then enables the institutions to actually realize very quickly many of these objectives. They can do so in this specific crisis mode, which in a way enables bypassing normal sort of open deliberative processes. And they are then able to actually build on solutions that would have been considered illegal for just a while ago. And I say considered for one reason. The reason is that, of course, in the EU constitutional structure or system, what is illegal is what the Court of Justice will find illegal. But we all know that the European Court of Justice has a certain degree of scrutiny, which is not very stringent. And this has led to a pattern where actually the most stringent constitutional control, in fact, takes place in certain constitutional courts in the member states, and in a way, a new dynamic relationship between national courts and the Court of Justice. And while these solutions are then justified with reference to an ongoing crisis, we have to do this because there's a crisis. In fact, what emerges are permanent solutions, which you tend to empower the executive branch very much at the expense of parliamentary powers, both at the level of the EU and national parliaments. And my worry there is that, especially when we talk about fiscal integration, I think the EU really needs that and has a lot of potential for deepening political integration in the EU as well. But the outcome of what has sort of emerges from all of these crises is not particularly stable or democratically sustainable union. And I think we should really seriously consider how we move forward from where we are. And of course, it is rather normal that a crisis is a gray hole. This is something I've used before. I'm not saying it's a black hole in the sense of there being no law, but it certainly is a gray hole where the law is rather vague. There are some legal constraints on executive action, but they're rather insubstantial, so that in fact the government gets to do pretty much as it pleases. And this is particularly true, I think, in the EU. This is an argument I've developed in a book that just came out last fall with Cambridge University Press called The Politics of Legal Expertise in EU Policymaking. And then, of course, we look at constitutional theory in general. I mean, if you read about crises and emergencies, the standard argument is that during a crisis, the executive can have extensive powers, but then when the crisis is over, you should return to a certain setting of normalcy, that you sort of surrender the extra powers that you've had during a crisis and you go back to normal parliamentary procedures. And I argue that in the EU, usually this never takes place, but we in a way use these executive empowerments then to become the new normal. And when the next crisis comes, we actually build on the previous crisis and expand further. And this is the pattern that worries me. So what I wanted to talk about in particular is to say something about budgetary power and democracy and why they matter, how they're understood more generally, and how they've emerged in the context of the three crises we've recently seen: Euro crisis, COVID crisis, rule of law crisis, which I think all have this same pattern of strengthening the executive in relation to both the European Parliament and national parliament. It's not the same solution that we do every time. We've learned from mistakes, but while doing so and while adjusting, we've actually created new problems. And at the same time, we've lost something that has always been there in EU budgetary law, a sense of sort of parallelism between budgetary and legislative power, basically meaning that the EU can fund what it can legislate on, has been the general pattern. And that in the context of the new crisis, we've had climate, Ukraine, energy, we're actually applying the previous new normal to the new crisis as well, and actually seem to be continuing very much in the same path. So now first about budgetary power very briefly. I mean, I think sort of this is something I've been trying to write about actually together with Tapio Raunio, a colleague of mine, looking both into legal but also political science literature and looking at the concept of political or budgetary power and what it means, I mean, how it should be applied in a democracy. And it's surprisingly how little there has been written and researched on this topic in general, but also in particular in the context of EU fiscal integration. In the EU, of course, we know that the European Parliament has significant budgetary powers, and this applies in particular to the approval of the annual budget. This is something that the Court of Justice have been very keen to protect so far. But if you look at literature more generally, I mean, the actor that speaks most about budgetary power is the German Constitutional Court, which in many of these recent rulings on both the EU treaties, but also the crisis measures, underlines how important the budget is in a democratic system, basically. That there must be a parliamentary debate on the budget, and it really is the general debate on policy. And now what I argue is that the impact of many of these EU crisis measures on parliamentary power has been tremendously considerable at national level, but they have also in a very significant way eroded the European Parliament's power to steer union expenditure in relation to the many executives that the EU system knows. We know there are many of them, only one parliament. And this is, of course, the pattern that started already with the euro crisis. We know that that basically economic policy coordination used to be very soft, built on non-binding recommendations. The idea was basically to give some recommendations, but then it was pretty much left to the member states to see what they did with that. And that did not end very well. So, of course, the adjustment then came to try to prevent national mistakes, increase control from the center, from the EU executive, and led to a system where basically the EU executive, EU institutions, together with the participation of national governments, basically tries to guide member state budgetary policies at every stage of the budgetary cycle. But that did not really work too well either, because national parliaments were not very happy about the recommendations. They had so-called poor ownership, which basically meant that national parliaments did not always embrace the recommendations. And there was always complaints about a very low level of implementation at national level. Many of these crisis solutions were also sort of intergovernmental in nature. They were based outside the EU treaties. European Council was hugely important, Eurogroup hugely important, but overall the solution was not very successful, and in particular the strong conditionality that was built into the bailout and the programs led to a lot of national resistance, polarization, poor ownership, and so forth. So not a really good model. Which then left to another solution, which was in a way the shift to positive incentives. And the idea was that we could use EU money to make these recommendations stronger. And basically the idea was that we would start from the EU budget to actually fund measures that fall under national competence. And the idea was there, of course, that the EU would get new powerful tools to direct member states, and actually sort of without any need to worry about whose policy it is, whether it's a national competence area or whether it's an EU competence area. The EU could intervene in anything, basically, that it funds. And that was a major change. And of course, this approach was even further strengthened in the attempts to try to tackle the rule of law crisis, where ideas of budgetary conditionality then were further strengthened. And then we came to the next generation EU, which was in a way timed conveniently, in the sense that it happened while the negotiations on the MFF were ongoing. There, in a way, the crisis mode enabled a very big change, in the sense that sort of the major legal issue that had always hindered the development in this area, namely the questioning of whether the EU could issue debt in order to fund policies, suddenly disappeared in the face of the pandemic. It was a solution that was, unlike many of the previous ones, now placed in the EU institutional and constitutional framework, where I would argue it does not sit very well. And we see the sort of further expansion of the idea that the EU's role is growing because it basically can do anything that it funds. So this is a program that can be used to fund nearly anything. However, there's been an attempt to, in a way, tackle the ownership problem by now moving the emphasis from the EU executive to national governments, who actually get to design their own policies to a tremendously large extent. These funds do not go in a way to European public goods, but they go to national policy objectives that are placed on national legislative agendas. As far as EU budgetary law is concerned, this is a very drastic move in the sense that it is done as a form of externally assigned revenue, which means that it falls outside the annual budget. And this is constitutionally a fairly big thing. And the outcome there, of course, is also that it's legally a very fragile construction, but it also very clearly divides states between net contributors, net beneficiaries, which is then strengthened further by the fact that we're not in the business of funding sort of shared common objectives, but in fact, national policy measures, which in a way turns it into a rather divisive and fragile tool. And of course, in the background has constantly been a question, an unresolved question about whether this is exceptional or permanent. And I think this was the theme that was very strong in the Finnish debate up here on the approval of the own resources decision, which was a very fierce debate. And there you can see actually the Commission also sending very clearly two types of messages about this just within actually one day. Commissioner Dombrovskis tweeting first in Finnish to the Finnish audience, obviously, this is a one-time only, will never happen again, while actually just the day before informing the Parliament that the Commission is already looking into the possibility of designing new mechanisms of the same kind. So clearly, sort of the question of permanent or exceptional being a rather unresolved, also challenged question. And the back, of course, are big and divisive political questions about the orientation of Europe, which remain unresolved and which are tremendously difficult to solve in the context of a European Council meeting, for example, that takes place in the middle of a very acute crisis. Here I refer to actually a study that we did in the context of one Horizon 2020 project, which just ended, where we did quite a lot of mapping of citizen opinions on what they would like the EU to become. And for me, it was quite interesting, the results basically showing that citizens seem to be, this was done in 6 states in different parts of Europe, basically saying that the citizens are quite divided about whether the EU needs more power or whether actually the current state is quite good. Also showing that the idea of European solidarity is equally divisive and that there are really big country differences on this question. Finally, everyone agreeing that the EU is needed in those areas that are transnational in character. And finally, that there should be much more democracy, more transparency in how these crises are being handled. Now I want to close with a few words on the few crises that have happened since then. And of course, the climate crisis is the big one. And for that, we got a big legislative package from the Commission already last summer, the Fit for 55 package, which is interesting for the reason that it introduces a number of new own resources. These are not legally problematic at all. That's certainly possible, but of course, fundamentally important as well, and could be debated much more. What is interesting from the perspective of fiscal integration is that unlike indicated earlier, they're actually not used to pay back just Next Generation EU, but would be used to fund a new social climate fund, which is in fact not a climate measure, but more a social policy measure. And that actually I see as a rather big move, in the sense that it's clearly related to the social pillar, which the EU has been trying to set up for years, but which has, for competence reasons, remained rather empty. Another issue to point out there is that many of these more recent proposals are again structured as external assigned revenue. So again, going outside the EU budget, which to me indicates that this practice, in a way that was introduced as a highly exceptional case, is in fact becoming the new normal, and is not good news for the European Parliament. And then, of course, Russia's war in Ukraine has also, as already mentioned, brought about big changes, and I think there is broad agreement on this in the EU, but the changes are remarkable all the same. There's a lot of discussion about the need to issue new debt, and we all know that funding will be needed, but that discussion is about starting. There's the Repower EU proposal, which has provoked a bit of discussion, because obviously the idea there is to rechannel some of the unused COVID-19 funds to new uses, which probably many feel is justified, but of course takes the package further from its original use, which was justified with reference to the pandemic. And then, of course, in the area of security and defense, we find big changes. And there, I think what is remarkable is that, in fact, in defense and security, the EU actually would have massive competence where it really could move forward in terms of a common defense. But this really we have not seen, and is likely to remain very unused. But as mentioned, there is, of course, the European Peace Facility, which also in a way builds on a big legal debate of many years, because it's also another off-budget funding mechanism. And why is it off-budget? It's off-budget because the EU treaty says EU budget cannot be used to finance military expenditure. So there is a legal question behind that issue as well. So basically, the argument that I would want to make is that I think we would need a lot more fiscal integration, but it's not a very good way to create it through sort of crisis mechanisms and crisis solutions that are taken in response of a very acute crisis, because there's nothing else you can do, and which then in a way lay ground to the new normal. And we never see the return to normalcy. At the same time, we have created a model, a very technocratic governance model for issues involving budgets and fiscal decision making, which is really far from the sort of ideal of democratic decision making, which we believed should be a central element. It's as if actually many of these mechanisms were created with that perspective in mind, that we try to stay clear of national parliaments, in particular, messing up things and making decisions that are difficult to predict. And in a way, as a method of constitutional development, this is rather problematic. I'm also rather concerned about the sort of lacking European public goods that I think shared money should be used to fund. And there's been tremendously little discussion about that, because obviously these are the things where we could all win. There would not be so clearly winners and losers, but these would be something that promote shared objectives. And then, of course, the idea that we used to have, that the EU funds things over which it has power to legislate, which I think initially was a fairly good idea. It meant that basically the European Parliament's role also remained at the core of decision making in these matters in the EU. And then, of course, for us lawyers, a very fundamental question, of course, is also the relevance of the treaties in EU fiscal integration. We've gone fairly long from what the treaties actually stipulate. And of course, this is the question that has also come up in the discussions on the future of Europe, where the position on treaty change has been relatively negative so far, but perhaps that's an issue that should be looked more carefully into. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Paivi. You've done a nice guidance to the fragility of fiscal integration, among other things. Now, let me give you the floor to Professor Paul de Grauwe to guide us through the fragility of something that is related to the fragility of fiscal integration, which is the fragility of the euro area. Please, Paul, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you, and Nuno. Thanks also to the organizers for the invitation. I feel very pleased and honored to be able to talk to you today. Let me share screen. Okay, so I would like to talk about the Eurozone fragility. How has it evolved over time? Should we worry about this, or is that all over now? Let me just start out with a picture. Sometimes a picture can tell a big story also. Here I show you the spreads of the 10-year government bonds in the Eurozone from 1991 until today, basically. And the spreads are defined as the difference of the long-term, the 10-year government bond yield of a particular country with the German 10-year government bond yield. Right? So the German bond is considered to be the risk-free bond. And here you see the following things that you know, but it's nice to see that in one picture. During the 1990s, prior to the start of EMU, we had large spreads, right? And these spreads in those days reflected devaluation risk, because each of these countries had their own currency, could therefore devalue it, and therefore investors that, for example, were investing in Italian bond expressed in lira had to take into account that the lira could devalue, and as a result, they wanted a risk premium to compensate them for this risk that could occur in the future. And these devaluation risks were quite significant, as you can see there. And then in the process towards a monetary union, we saw that these devaluation risk premia tended to decline, and they disappeared once we were in the monetary union. And everybody fell asleep, so to say. Nobody cared any longer. And this was a remarkable period. So this is the period from, say, 2000. In the case of Greece, it starts 2002, but the other countries, it started earlier, where investors were saying a Greek bond has the same risk as a German bond. When we think about this today, we say, how is this possible? Were all these people blind? And yet that's what the market was saying. The same yield on a Greek and a German bond. They are perfect substitutes. Remarkable. And then suddenly with the financial crisis, a wake-up call, right? Suddenly people realized that there was something like a default risk, that these governments actually could possibly default. And as a result, the spreads exploded. And in fact, in some cases, even became higher than those that existed during the devaluation crisis. So this is the story that I want to tell you. And note also the following, because I will focus a little bit on this for a minute or two. The countries that experienced these devaluation risks in the 1990s, they're also the same who later on experienced default crisis. And that I did the following little exercise. I asked myself the question, how well do the spreads of the 1990s, the spreads in those days expressing the devaluation risk, how well do they forecast? How well do they predict?
Are you going into town, love? Are you?
Am I going on?
Okay. Yeah, but I'll be back around 8.
So,
I'll
Brigitte,
probably be in bed. I don't think I'll go
Brigitte,
soon.
could you shut off your micro, please?
Okay.
Sorry.
This was like Deus ex machina, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so I was asking myself the question, do these spreads that reflected devaluation risk in the 90s, are they good predictors of the default risk that emerged later on during the sovereign debt crisis? And the answer is yes, they are quite a good predictor. And here I show you the evidence. On the horizontal axis, I show you the mean spreads during the 1990s of all these spreads of these in these bond markets. And on the vertical axis, I show you the mean spreads during the financial crisis and the sovereign debt crisis, 2008, 2005. And you can see that this is a relatively good predictor. The R square is 0.82. So it's, yeah, it looks like there is an original sin. Those who were in trouble in the 1990s carry a sin with them in the monetary union, and it emerges again in the monetary union. Even more important, I asked the question, do these devaluation risks of the 1990s predict the spreads today in 2022? And here's the answer. Yes, even better. My R square is 0.85. So on the horizontal axis, I have again the spreads in the 1990s. And on the vertical axis now, I have the mean spreads during 2022, the recent surge in the spreads. And again, those who are in trouble in the 1990s appear the same countries that are in trouble today. And also the classification, the more in trouble you were in the 1990s, the more in trouble you are today. So there seems to be something there. So what is going on here? Well, it has very much to do with the fragility, right? And here, the point that I want to make is that fixed exchange rate systems and a monetary union, as we have created, have the same structure of fragility. Why is that? Well, the fixed exchange rate system are fragile constructions because the central banks make a commitment to convert the domestic currency in a foreign currency at a fixed price. So it's a promise to convert the domestic currency into a foreign currency at a fixed price in the future. The problem is that these central banks may not have the foreign currency to do that after some shock. And the expectation that the central banks may not have their foreign currency to do that, to come to that commitment, may create a self-fulfilling speculative crisis that forces the central bank to devalue. So fragility here is susceptibility, vulnerability to self-fulfilling crisis in the markets. And something similar is the case in the Eurozone. When you think about it, here sovereigns, the governments, when they issue bonds now in a monetary union, they issue bonds in euros, which is de facto a foreign currency from the point of view of the sovereign. Right? And this sovereign actually commits itself to convert the bonds at maturity in cash in euros. But as in the case of the central bank in the fixed exchange rate system, these sovereigns may not have the euros and they cannot create them, right? Because the central bank will not back up the commitment of this national government. The ECB is a faraway central bank and is not committed to do so. And as a result, the guarantee that the government gives to bondholders is a weak guarantee, right? And this can lead to a self-fulfilling liquidity crisis. If fear exists that the sovereign may not have the euros to pay out the bondholders at maturity, this may trigger a self-fulfilling liquidity crisis that could force the hand of the sovereign and actually force it into default, or possibly also, and that's what has happened during the sovereign debt crisis, forcing into excessive austerity because it needs to find the cash to pay out the bondholders. And you can see that the Eurozone and fixed exchange rates have essentially the same fragility. They face the same fragility because the commitments these authorities make may not necessarily be held. It took the ECB until September 2012 to understand this problem. And it started to understand this when the Eurozone was close to implosion, right? And that's when it announced that it actually would be a central bank willing to commit unlimited amount of liquidity in these national government bond markets. This was the OMT, right? Unlimited liquidity support. It's important here, the idea of unlimited support, right? And once the central bank had done that, fear and panic disappeared in the market, right? And we learned, and the ECB learned, that the liquidity support, the lender of last resort support, was essential for maintaining the Eurozone alive, right? In a way, you can also say that whatever it takes that Draghi was calling about was actually an admission that the primary responsibility of the ECB is to maintain financial stability, that is stability in the government bond market. And what about price stability then? Well, I will come back to that and argue that maybe financial stability may have to be the primary responsibility. And let's not forget that in history, central banks were created always to solve an endemic instability problem in financial markets. Right? That's why we created central banks. No central bank before the ECB was created to maintain price stability. So the Bank of England was not created because they said, oh, we have to keep inflation. No, it was because there were banking crises all the time that shattered the economy, that led to great instability, that central banks were created. And surprisingly, when we created the ECB, this was forgotten. It was thought that the ECB actually should only care about price stability, while financial stability is, if anything, probably more important than price stability. Let me show you a little exercise that I did here to illustrate the power of this announcement, right? When the ECB came out and said, I'm going to support the bond markets. Here I show you on the horizontal axis the initial spreads prior to the announcement in 2012, right? And on the vertical axis, I show you the change in the spread during 2013. So how much did these spreads decline? And here you can see that it's almost a perfect fit, right? My R square is 0.977, right? It says that the spreads declined, and the only explanatory variable was the size of the initial spread. So here's Greece, right, which had the highest initial spread. Greece experienced the largest decline of its spread. Then came Italy, and then the others, right? So it was basically the announcement, and then all these spreads collapsed. And of course, those that were at the highest level, right, the highest in the mountain, they fell the lowest, right? And then I did the same exercise and asked myself the question, how important were the fundamentals in the decline in these spreads during that same period, right? And here I put on the horizontal axis the change in the debt to GDP ratio from 2012 to 2013, right? How much was there a change in the fundamental? And on the vertical axis, I show you the same change in the spread from before the announcement over the next year afterwards, right? And what you can see here, that there is practically no relationship. In fact, if there is one, it's perverse. That is that countries whose debt to GDP ratio had increased the most actually experienced the strongest decline in their spreads. But I don't want to attach any importance in that because it's not significant. So basically what this says is that the change in fundamentals had no bearing whatsoever in reducing these spreads. It was pure the action of the ECB that was confronted with fear and panic in the market. And by announcing this, it eliminated the fear and things came back to normal. Right? So this is the power of a central bank when it announces that it is willing to provide unlimited liquidity in the market. Then came the pandemic, and the pandemic would be the first test of, is this going to work, right? Because this was a huge shock, right? The pandemic, if anything, was the economic shock was even bigger than the financial crisis. Here I show you how the GDP declined in a number of countries the first semester of 2020. So we had declines of more than 10% in some countries in just 6 months, right? An incredible collapse. But also it was very different, right? Some countries experienced extreme declines, others much less. So here we were again confronted with some deep asymmetry. And the question was, or some people had feared that this could lead to a new sovereign debt crisis, right? But it didn't happen. The sovereign debt crisis didn't happen. There was an early hiccup. Here I show you the spreads again, the same as what I showed you earlier, but focused on the period 2019 up to May of this year. And what you can see at the moment of the pandemic that erupted as the vertical line, you had a hiccup of the spreads, but then quickly they went down again. I will come back to the later period there where you see the moving up again. So you can quickly see that there was an initial fear that, yes, maybe this pandemic may do something, but that this was quickly dissipated. Why is that? Well, essentially because the monetary instrument, that is the lender of last resort facility that the ECB had as a backstop, right, was also made very explicit by the creation of the PPP. That was an announcement of a new program of massive buying in the government bond markets. And that pacified the market. And add to that the fiscal instrument, the Next Generation EU, funded by the issue of common bonds, and that further provided confidence in the future of the Eurozone. I think that was another reason why, despite the size of the shock, the pandemic did not lead to a sovereign debt crisis. And then I come to my last point, and what about today with inflation, right? The surge of inflation. I show you again the spreads during the period 2019-2022, and you can see that since the beginning of the year, the spreads have increased a lot again, right? They are still below what we have seen before. Huh? I mean, this is still relatively benign, probably because there is an expectation still that the ECB is ready to act if the need arises. But there is the problem here that this is related to the fact that inflation has surged. The central bank is now perceived to be ready to fight inflation, which means ready to increase interest rates. And then there is the fear that these increases in the interest rates will have an amplified effect on the yields of the other countries. Here I show you the change in the yield during 2022, so the last 6 months, right? The change in the yield per unit of change in the German yield. So it's the ratio of, for example, here I show Greece, the ratio of the change in the Greek bond yield relative to the German bond yield. So for, say, let's say a 100 basis point increase of the German bond yield, on average, the Greek bond increases by 164 basis points, right? So an amplification effect. So in other words, the yields tend to increase when the interest rate, the level of the interest rate increases. So, and that is worrisome. Huh? Can we control it? Is there at some point going to be a problem that if the ECB really has to fight inflation by drastic increases in the interest rate, this may get out of hand. And so the ECB today is confronted with a double dilemma. Right? The traditional dilemma is the one that all central banks face when a supply shock occurs. When a supply shock occurs, negative supply shock, that means that output tends to decline and inflation goes up, right? And as a result, the central bank is in a dilemma situation. Should it fight inflation by raising the interest rate, then it creates the risk of recession. If it wants to avoid recession, then it has to allow inflation to increase. And that's the difficult choice all central banks face today, right? Given that we face this negative supply shock. But the ECB is facing an additional dilemma that has to do with this fragility, the instability of the government bond markets. It's the choice between fighting inflation and fighting instability of the government bond market. When the central bank is increasing the interest rate, right, to fight inflation, because it wants to pursue its objective of price stability. So the increase in the interest rate may actually turn around the budgetary situation dramatically of the member countries. And here I show you this R minus G, right, which has been quite much discussed by economists. R is the nominal interest rate on the government bonds, and G is the nominal growth rate of the economy. And up to today, the last few years, R minus G has been negative. That is, the interest rate on government bonds has been lower than the nominal growth of the economy. And that's something stabilizing, right? When you are in a situation like this, then the debt to GDP ratio tends to decline automatically. So there is a stabilizing element in the economy, right? And that's why, for example, today, the Italian debt to GDP ratio is tending to decline automatically. But fighting inflation by the central bank changes that relationship. You raise the interest rate, so R tends to go up. And if the central bank is successful in lowering inflation, G goes down. And you could turn around the relationship. A successful but strong inflation-fighting central bank may actually make R minus G positive, and therefore reintroduce the instability in the debt dynamics, because under that regime, R exceeds G, the debt to GDP ratio tends to increase faster, tends to increase automatically, sorry. And this then is like opening up the box of Pandora, right? And facing the central bank with this dilemma, right? And will the ECB keep its price stability as primary objective, even if that leads to instability in the sovereign bond markets? The answer is uncertain. But let me speculate. In times of crisis, at least if the ECB is not in suicide mode, it will accept that the primary objective should be to keep the Eurozone alive, like it did in 2012. Therefore, it will have to make price stability a secondary objective. It will have to accept, in other words, more inflation. So if this happens, I'm speculating, right? If this happens, of course, this will lead to political conflicts within the Eurozone, because some countries may not accept that the central bank sets aside its primary objective so as to maintain stability in the government bond markets. And therefore, the choice will be between, on the one hand, instability and crisis in the sovereign bond markets if the ECB maintains its strict inflation targeting, or political conflicts when the ECB relaxes its anti-inflationary stance. As you can see, the fragility of the Eurozone is still with us. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Paul. Very, very nice presentation. Claudio, are you there? I was wondering how long do we have